In the center of the restaurant, beneath garlands of fresh pine and the amber glow of 100 candles, Marcus Reed slipped a small white bakery box onto the plastic table where his son waited. The boy's paper Santa hat tilted as he looked up, 7 years old and too careful with hope. Marcus struck a match, the sulfur sharp in air that smelled of roasted meat and cinnamon, and touched flame to a single birthday candle pressed into frosting that had smeared during the day. They sat together in the service alcove, that forgotten space between the bright dining room and the fluorescent chaos of the dish pit, and for 3 minutes the world shrank to the size of candlelight and the quiet hum of jingle bells under Dylan's breath. At table 17, the corner spot by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the street where December pressed cold against glass, Elena Whitmore cut her salmon into precise squares and lifted her fork. The movement froze halfway to her mouth. Through the gap between a family of 8 and a couple holding hands across the tablecloth, she saw them. A man and a boy, heads bowed over something small and sacred, smiling like they held a secret too precious to share. The knife slipped from her other hand and clattered against bone china. Her chest constricted with a pain so sudden she mistook it for a heart attack before recognizing it as something far more dangerous. Loneliness, the kind that money couldn't fill and success couldn't cure, and 10 years of Christmas dinners at this same table had only made worse. The words left her mouth before she could stop them, barely a whisper, cracked at the edges with a desperation she hadn't let herself feel in a decade. Famos. Can I join you? The restaurant had stood since 1973, a cornerstone establishment where old brick met new glass and families came for occasions that mattered. Tonight, Christmas Eve, it transformed into the kind of place that appeared on greeting cards sent from better, gentler versions of America. Red candles flickered on every table, flames reflected in polished silverware that caught the light and threw it back softer. The pianist, an elderly man with liver-spotted hands who had played here for 23 years, moved through silent night with reverence that made servers pause mid-stride, their tray balanced, their rushing stilled by muscle memory of beauty. Conversations overlapped in symphony. Children pleaded for breadsticks. Mothers reminded them about napkins. Fathers told the same stories they told every year because tradition mattered more than novelty. Marcus Archer moved through this world like shadow, present but unnoticed, essential but invisible. At 36, he had worked here 4 years, first as a server when he desperately needed any job that would let him support his son, then taking on maintenance when the night manager discovered he could fix the espresso machine with nothing but a screwdriver, and patience inherited from a father who'd worked as a mechanic before arthritis claimed his hands. Tonight he wore black slacks from the discount rack at the big box store 2 miles from his apartment, checked every other week because sometimes they marked things down twice if they didn't sell. In a white shirt he pressed himself every Sunday evening, using an iron that had belonged to his late wife. He moved the heated metal across fabric in the same careful pattern she'd taught him during their first month of marriage, back when the future still looked like something they could build together instead of something that would collapse and leave him holding a 2-year-old boy and a stack of medical bills that never got smaller. His hands were clean but rough, calloused across the palms from 100 repairs, small scars mapping the geography of work. A burn from the grill when he'd helped the line cook during a rush. A slice from the box cutter when he was unloading supplies. The permanent groove in his right index finger from years of gripping screwdrivers. These were hands that knew labor intimately and had made peace with it, though peace looked less like acceptance and more like resigned agreement that this was how life worked for men like him. Men who'd peaked in high school as decent athletes with decent grades and then discovered that decent didn't pay rent or buy asthma medication or cover the gap between what grocery stores charged and what food stamps provided. Earlier, during the lunch rush when the dining room had been half empty and Gloria had sent him on break, Marcus had walked 6 blocks to the discount bakery on Lexington. The wind cut through his jacket, the thin canvas one he'd bought 3 winters ago that still functioned, but had stopped keeping him truly warm somewhere around February of the second year. Inside, the bakery smelled like sugar and yeast and the particular sadness of day-old goods. Behind the counter, Mrs. Chen, 70 if she was a day, her hands permanently dusted with flour, had looked up as the bell chimed his entrance. She knew him. Everyone who worked for tips in a 5-block radius knew each other. That fraternity of people whose livelihoods depended on strangers' generosity and who understood without speaking that solidarity mattered when the world treated you as interchangeable. The clearance rack held 3 cupcakes, marked down because the frosting had smeared during transport, or the edges had dried, or simply because they'd survived past the arbitrary deadline that separated full price from desperate. Marcus had picked up the chocolate one, vanilla frosting crushed on one side where it had pressed against the box, the swirl that should have looked deliberate instead looking like evidence of mishandling. $3 reduced to $1.50. He'd pulled 2 crumpled bills from his wallet, the leather worn soft as cloth at the fold, and Mrs. Chen had rung it up without comment. But as he turned to leave, she'd called him back and pressed a small bag into his hands. 2 fortune cookies, the kind she gave away free with orders over $10, which his had not been. Her voice had been gentle, accented, certain. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart." Marcus had felt his throat close. Kindness from strangers always hit harder than cruelty, because cruelty you could armor against. But kindness found the gaps in your defense and struck bone. He'd managed to mumble thanks and walk back to the restaurant with the bag clutched against his chest like it contained something more valuable than a damaged cupcake and 2 fortune cookies that probably held fortunes about prosperity and good luck. Platitudes that felt like mockery when your checking account held $37 and payday was 3 days away. Now at 8:45 on Christmas Eve, Marcus stood in the employee break room and carefully retrieved the white box from the staff refrigerator where he'd hidden it behind leftover soup containers in someone's Tupperware of questionable casserole. His hands shook slightly as he opened it, checking for the 100th time that the cupcake had survived the day. The frosting had melted a little from being in the fridge, then hardened again into something that looked almost intentional if you squinted and wanted to believe. He'd used a plastic knife from the drawer to smooth the worst of the damage, trying to create the illusion that someone had chosen this design, that this was how it was supposed to look. Miguel Hernandez leaned against the doorframe, 28 and still optimistic in the way Marcus remembered being before life taught him that optimism was a luxury. Miguel pulled doubles most weeks, sent money back to family in Puebla, and somehow still found energy to joke with customers and compliment the kitchen staff in rapid Spanish that made them laugh. Now he watched Marcus's careful restoration of the cupcake with an expression caught between sympathy and something darker. His words came easy, casual. "Why not just buy a fresh one, Hermano? Only costs another $1.50. The response left Marcus's mouth harder than intended, sharp enough to cut. $1.50 is bus fare for 2 days. Miguel's hands came up in immediate surrender. "All right, man, I hear you." But the damage had been done, the space between them suddenly wider. Marcus recognized the pattern even as he fell into it. Someone offered help, he heard judgment. Someone suggested easier paths, he heard condescension. The walls he'd built around himself, necessary walls that kept him functioning and kept Dylan safe and kept them both moving forward despite everything, had become so thick he couldn't tell anymore where protection ended and prison began. He wanted to apologize, to explain that his anger wasn't really directed at Miguel, but at the universe that made $1.50 matter, at the arithmetic of poverty that turned every decision into a calculation of what you could afford to lose. But apologies required vulnerability, and vulnerability required energy. And he had exactly enough energy to get through his shift and get Dylan home safely. Nothing left over for emotional accounting. Miguel left without another word, his footsteps fading down the hallway toward the kitchen, and Marcus was alone with his cupcake and his shame and the knowledge that he'd just pushed away one of the few people in this building who'd ever treated him like more than an employee number. He closed the box carefully, the cardboard soft from moisture, and carried it through the service corridor toward the alcove where Dylan waited. The alcove existed in the space between worlds, too close to the dining room to belong fully to the back of house, but too far from the kitchen to be considered front of house. It held a folding table spotted with ancient coffee rings, 3 mismatched folding chairs, and a bulletin board covered in scheduling notices and health code reminders, and a faded poster about sexual harassment from 2018 that no one had bothered to update. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed intermittently, sometimes bright enough to read by, and sometimes dim enough that you had to squint at your phone screen. It smelled like industrial cleaner and fryer oil, and underneath everything else, the ghost of 1,000 staff meals eaten standing up. Dylan Reed sat on the least wobbly chair, feet dangling 6 inches from the linoleum. His shoes were Nike knockoffs, purchased 2 sizes too large from the outlet mall 40 minutes away, where Marcus had driven on his day off because the savings justified the gas. The laces were double knotted the way Marcus had taught him, tight enough that they wouldn't come undone during the day, but not so tight they'd be impossible for 7-year-old fingers to untie at bedtime. His jeans came from the Goodwill on Fifth, washed so many times the denim had gone soft, patched at one knee where he'd fallen during recess and torn through. The patch was iron-on, slightly crooked, because Marcus had done it himself while Dylan slept, following instructions from a YouTube video watched on his phone with the volume turned down low. The paper Santa hat had been made at school during the last week before winter break. Construction paper, red and white, carefully folded and stapled according to instructions from Mrs. Patterson, who taught second grade and understood that some of her students would go home to apartments where Christmas meant making do with whatever could be crafted from what you already had. The cotton ball at the tip hung slightly lopsided, attached with enough Elmer's glue to survive the walk from school to the restaurant in Dylan's backpack, which also held a change of clothes in case of accidents and his inhaler in case of asthma attacks, and a worn copy of Charlotte's Web that he'd been reading for the third time because the library let you keep books for 3 weeks and Marcus couldn't afford to buy new ones. In his lap, Dylan held a spiral notebook with a blue cover, the kind that cost 99 cents at the drugstore during back-to-school sales. The pages filled with drawings executed in whatever colored pencils the school provided during art period. Snowmen with carrot noses and stick arms. Houses with perfect triangular roofs and smoke curling from chimneys. Stars scattered across skies rendered in yellow and white, and sometimes purple because Dylan liked purple even though stars weren't purple. But art didn't have to be accurate to be true. At the bottom of one page, a family. Stick figures, father and son holding hands. No mother because Dylan had been 2 when she left and didn't remember her clearly enough to draw her. Though sometimes he asked questions that made Marcus's chest ache with the weight of answers he didn't know how to give. Dylan's personality existed in the space between childhood and something older, heavier. He understood things without being told. When Marcus worked late, Dylan didn't complain. When they ate pasta for the 4th night in a row because pasta was cheap and filling, Dylan said it was his favorite. When Christmas morning came and the presents under their small fake tree were fewer and smaller than what his classmates would receive, Dylan would smile and say it was enough. And Marcus would see in his son's eyes that terrible knowledge that children shouldn't have to carry, the awareness that their happiness required them to want less, to expect less, to be grateful for scraps while other children feasted. Now Dylan looked up as Marcus approached, the paper Santa hat slipping slightly to one side. His voice came quiet, practiced at not disturbing, trained in the art of being invisible in spaces where children technically weren't allowed. Is it time? Marcus set the white box on the table between them, careful not to jostle it, and produced from his pocket a single birthday candle. White wax, thin as a pencil, the kind that came 50 to a package for $2 at the grocery store, purchased once a year and rationed for small celebrations. Dylan's actual birthday in March. Christmas. Sometimes Fridays when the week had been particularly hard and they both needed a reminder that small joys still existed. He pressed the candle into the cupcake's frosting, pushing until it stood upright, and struck a match from a book he'd taken from the bar earlier. The flame caught on the second try, burning steady in the still air of the alcove. Dylan began to hum, so quietly it might have been breathing, the melody of Jingle Bells fractured and hesitant. Marcus joined in, his voice rough from years of not singing, slightly off-key but earnest. For 3 minutes and 40 seconds they existed in a bubble of their own making, a private world where poverty didn't matter because they had each other, where a $1.50 cupcake tasted like abundance because it was shared with love, where Christmas happened in a service alcove instead of under a decorated tree in a house with a mortgage because location was less important than presence. Dylan's voice broke the humming, barely louder than the buzz of the fluorescent light, fragile as spun glass. I'm sorry we can't go home and have a big dinner like other families. The words landed like physical blows, each one a small violence against the walls Marcus had built around his heart to keep functioning. He reached across the plastic table and took his son's hand. Dylan's fingers were cold despite the warmth of the restaurant, always cold because he was too small to generate enough body heat, and the winter coat from the thrift store was serviceable but not perfect, good enough to keep him from freezing, but not good enough to keep him truly warm. Marcus's throat tightened with the familiar ache of wanting to give his son the world and having only a damaged cupcake to offer, of measuring his adequacy as a father in the gap between what Dylan deserved and what Marcus could provide. His voice came rough but certain, each word chosen with the care of a man who understood that words were all he had. Dylan, listen to me. You are my family. Sitting here with you is the best Christmas I could ask for. But Dylan's eyes dropped to the table and Marcus saw the shame there, the internalized inadequacy that came from comparing his life to the lives of children who had more. I didn't get you anything. All the other kids at school were talking about the presents they bought their parents. Timothy got his mom a necklace. Sarah made her dad a picture frame. I didn't have money for anything. The confession broke something in Marcus, some final defense against the accumulated weight of every choice he'd made since Jenna had left. Every calculation of what they could afford to lose. Every moment of Dylan going without because Marcus's paycheck could only stretch so far. He squeezed his son's hand gently, feeling the delicate bones beneath the skin, the precious fragility of this child who'd been entrusted to his care and who he'd somehow kept alive and mostly healthy despite everything stacked against them. His words came from somewhere deep and true, a place that existed before poverty had taught him to measure worth in dollars. You're here, that's everything. You know what the best present is? Having someone who wants to spend time with you. Everything else is just stuff. You are the gift, Dylan. You always have been. Dylan smiled, small and certain, the kind of smile that came from a deep well of trust that Marcus had somehow, despite everything, managed not to poison. He leaned forward, closed his eyes for 3 full seconds like he was making a wish he truly believed would come true, and blew out the candle. The smoke curled upward in a thin ribbon, disappearing into the restaurant's warm air, carrying whatever hope a 7-year-old boy had whispered into the darkness of adult failure and childhood resilience. Gloria Martinez appeared at the edge of the alcove, her presence announced by the soft squeak of her practical shoes against linoleum. 52 years old with 3 teenagers at home and eyes that had seen too many single parents struggle against mathematics that never added up in their favor. She'd worked here 14 years, started as a server like Marcus, worked her way to shift supervisor, then assistant manager, and finally manager when the previous one had been fired for inventory discrepancies that Gloria had quietly reported because some violations of trust mattered more than solidarity. She wore black slacks and a white blouse and a name tag that said her name and below it, manager in smaller letters. And she carried herself with the particular exhaustion of women who'd raised children alone and knew exactly what that cost. She'd been the one who'd given Marcus permission for Dylan to stay during his shifts, the approval that technically violated restaurant policy, but which she granted anyway because some things mattered more than rules written by people who'd never had to choose between childcare and employment. Earlier that day, when Marcus had approached her office and knocked on the doorframe because the door was always open, Gloria had looked up from the scheduling spreadsheet on her ancient desktop computer and listened to his careful request. She hadn't made him beg. She'd simply nodded, one short definitive movement that said yes, and also, I understand, and also I've been where you are, and told him to keep the boy out of sight of customers. Now she carried a paper cup of hot chocolate, the kind from the machine in the kitchen that dispensed lukewarm brown liquid that tasted vaguely of chemicals and corn syrup, but which children loved anyway. She set it in front of Dylan with a gentleness that spoke to her own years of motherhood, of understanding that small gestures carried weight beyond their material cost. Her voice came soft but carried an edge that made Marcus's stomach tighten. Heard they sold the building. New owners, some real estate woman. Marcus felt the ground shift beneath him, that particular sensation of stability revealing itself as illusion. That affect us? Gloria's expression remained neutral, the practiced mask of managers who'd learned not to show fear even when they felt it. Don't know yet. Let's just get through tonight. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Restaurant work existed in a state of permanent precarity, always one bad quarter or new owner or policy change away from unemployment. Marcus had learned long ago not to trust stability, to always keep his resume updated and his network maintained, and his expectations low enough that disappointment wouldn't break him. But knowledge didn't make it easier, didn't stop the spike of anxiety that came with any threat to the fragile ecosystem that kept him and Dylan housed and fed. Gloria squeezed his shoulder once, brief contact that said, "I'm sorry," and also, "We're all in this together," and also, "There's nothing I can do," then disappeared back toward the kitchen where the dinner rush was building toward its evening crescendo. Marcus watched her go and felt the familiar weight of powerlessness settle across his shoulders like a physical burden. He was 36 years old and his entire life could be upended by decisions made by people he'd never meet. People to whom he was just a line item on a balance sheet, a cost to be minimized, or a position to be eliminated. The knowledge burned like acid in his chest. Dylan tugged his sleeve, oblivious to the adult anxieties that had just been introduced into their small celebration. "Can I have the cupcake now?" Marcus pushed thoughts of new owners and uncertain futures into the mental box, where he kept all anxieties that couldn't be addressed immediately and focused on what mattered. His son, this moment, the chocolate cupcake with its reconstructed frosting sitting between them, like evidence that love could be measured in $1.50 increments if you didn't think too hard about what that said about the world. He used the plastic knife to cut the cupcake in half, careful to make the portions equal because fairness mattered even in this, and watched as Dylan took his first bite with the particular reverence children bring to sugar. The boy's face lit with pleasure uncomplicated by knowledge of discount bakeries or clearance racks or the arithmetic of poverty, and Marcus felt something in his chest loosen slightly. This was enough. It had to be enough, because it was all he had to give. In the break room 10 minutes later, after he'd settled Dylan back in the alcove with instructions to stay quiet and stay put, Marcus overheard the conversation that would reshape the remainder of his evening. Two servers, Ashley and Garrett, both younger than him by 5 years, both working their way through community college, both treating this job as temporary waypoint rather than permanent destination. They leaned against the industrial sink, voices lowered but not quite whispered, engaged in the particular gossip that service industry workers trafficked in. Ashley's words came fast, excited. "Elena Whitmore bought the building 2 months ago." Garrett responded with the tone of someone who'd done research. "She's here tonight. Table 17, like always." Ashley leaned in, conspiratorial. "I heard she's raising rents on all her properties. Jake's cousin works at that building on 3rd, said their rent went up 15%. The name meant nothing to Marcus initially, just another wealthy person whose decisions would ripple down to affect his life in ways he couldn't control. But the location, table 17, that triggered recognition. He'd served that table earlier, during the transition between lunch and dinner, when the dining room was quiet and the servers were rolling silverware and restocking condiment caddies. A woman alone eating salmon with precise movements, drinking wine she barely touched. He'd taken her order with professional efficiency, brought her food without commentary, cleared her plates when she'd finished. She'd thanked him with a voice that sounded like money and loneliness mixed in equal measure, and he'd thought nothing of it beyond calculating the tip she'd leave and whether it would be adequate. Now that interaction rearranged itself in his memory, taking on new significance. The woman who'd thanked him for salmon and steamed vegetables owned the building that housed the restaurant where he worked. She held his livelihood in hands that had probably never washed dishes or scrubbed toilets or fixed broken machinery. The resentment that followed this realization felt both justified and futile. Anger at a system he couldn't change and a person he didn't know directed at a target that probably didn't even register his existence. Marcus returned to the dining room with that knowledge sitting like a stone in his gut, making it harder to smile at customers and easier to see the vast gulf between worlds that existed in this single building. On one side, people who ate here because they wanted to, who left tips that represented discretionary spending, who would go home to houses with heating that worked and refrigerators that stayed full. On the other side, people like him, who worked here because they needed to, who counted every dollar against competing necessities, who understood that comfort was a luxury reserved for people who'd never had to choose between electricity and groceries. Table 17 sat in the premium location, corner spot by floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the street where December cold pressed against glass. The view showed the city lit for Christmas, lights strung across street lamps, storefront windows decorated with fake snow and mechanical Santa displays. From inside the warm restaurant, it looked beautiful, the kind of scene that appeared on postcards and in movies about the magic of the season. Marcus wondered what it looked like to people on the street, looking in at the warm golden light and the well-dressed diners and the abundance that seemed so natural from the inside, but which required entire armies of invisible labor to maintain. Elena Whitmore sat alone at that coveted table, surrounded by empty chairs that emphasized rather than diminished her solitude. At 34, she had built an empire in commercial real estate, the kind of success story that got written up in business magazines with headlines about vision and determination and the particular breed of ruthlessness required to succeed in a man's world. She'd purchased her first building at 28 with a loan that would have crushed most people, turning it into profit within 18 months through renovations she'd overseen personally and rent increases she'd implemented without hesitation. By 30, she'd owned 5 buildings. Now she held properties in 7 states, each one managed with cold efficiency that had made her wealthy and utterly alone. She came to this restaurant 3 times a week, always alone, always ordering the same meal. Grilled salmon with no sauce because she didn't trust rich food after years of eating meals from her desk, steamed vegetables cut into uniform pieces, a single glass of white wine that she sipped exactly 3 times before abandoning. The servers knew not to make small talk. Gloria knew to seat her away from families, away from celebrations, away from anything that might remind her of what she didn't have. Tonight, she wore charcoal cashmere that had cost $800 but felt like any other sweater, and pearl earrings that had belonged to her grandmother, one of the few people who'd loved her without conditions and who died when Elena was 14, leaving behind a silence that still echoed. Her table was set for one. It was always set for one. Single napkin folded into the shape of a swan, single water glass perspiring gently in warm air, single menu that she never opened because she always ordered the same thing, as if variety might introduce chaos into a life built on control and predictability. She cut her salmon into precise 1-inch squares and chewed each bite exactly 20 times, a habit developed at boarding school when eating was just another task to complete efficiently, when dining halls were places to survive rather than enjoy. The restaurant breathed with warmth and noise in the complicated beauty of human connection. At table 4, a family of 8 sang happy birthday to a little girl who stood on her chair to blow out 5 pink candles on a chocolate cake, her face scrunched in concentration. Her wish whispered so quietly only she would ever know what she'd asked for. At table 9, a couple in their 70s held hands across the tablecloth, embroidered with holly leaves, their fingers intertwined like roots grown together over decades. Wedding rings worn smooth by time and devotion. At table 12, 3 generations shared stories that made them lean in close, conspirators in their own joy, grandchildren hearing for the 100th time about the blizzard of 1980 or the Thanksgiving turkey that caught fire or the uncle who showed up to his own wedding and fishing waders because he'd lost track of time at the lake. Elena watched it all with the particular ache of someone looking through a window at a party they couldn't join. She'd learned early that achievement was something you could control, that success had rules, and if you followed them, you could build something that looked like fulfillment from the outside, even if it felt hollow within. Her parents had divorced when she was 6, her father remarrying within a year and starting a new family as if the first one had been practice he could discard once he'd figured out how to do it right. Her mother had moved to Europe and sent birthday cards that arrived 3 weeks late, the signatures increasingly illegible as years passed and guilt accumulated into something too heavy to face directly. Boarding school had taught Elena that if you wanted love, you had to earn it. Straight A's earned approval from teachers. Awards earned pride from administrators. Success earned respect from peers. She'd chased that formula into adulthood, building an empire on the belief that achievement could substitute for belonging, that if she just accomplished enough, someone would finally see her as valuable, as worthy, as enough. But tonight, surrounded by families who seemed to have solved some equation she couldn't figure out, she understood with sudden clarity that the formula had always been wrong. You couldn't earn belonging. It was just given or it wasn't. Earlier that morning in the conference room of her downtown office with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city she'd conquered, Elena had sat through a board meeting that should have felt like triumph but instead felt like indictment. Her CFO, a man named Richardson who wore expensive suits and cheaper ethics, had presented a cost-cutting proposal designed to increase profits by 12%, reduce staff benefits, increase rents on commercial tenants, eliminate paid sick leave. The numbers were sound, the logic unassailable. Shareholders would be pleased. Stock prices would rise. Elena had listened with her face arranged in an expression of professional consideration. The mask she'd worn so long it had fused to her actual face, making it impossible to tell where performance ended and person began. Board members had nodded along to Richardson's presentation, asking clarifying questions about timelines and implementation strategies and how to handle potential pushback from tenants. No one had asked about the people whose lives would be impacted, the workers who would lose health insurance, or the small businesses that would close when rent became unaffordable. Those considerations existed outside the spreadsheet, and what existed outside the spreadsheet didn't exist at all. When Richardson had finished his presentation and looked to Elena for approval, she'd given it with a single nod that contained no emotion, no hesitation, no recognition of the human cost embedded in those percentage points. The meeting had ended with handshakes and plans to reconvene in January to review implementation progress. And Elena had returned to her office and stared at her reflection in the window glass and failed to recognize the woman looking back. When had she become this? When had the distance between who she'd wanted to be and who she'd become grown so vast she could no longer see across it? Now, in the warm restaurant, cutting salmon into squares while families laughed and children sang and couples held hands, Elena felt the weight of that morning's decision pressing against her chest like a physical burden. Somewhere in this city, maybe in this building, people who worked for minimum wage and no benefits would soon lose what little safety net they had because she'd nodded once in a conference room and set in motion machinery that would grind through their lives with mechanical indifference. The knowledge sat in her stomach like poison, making each bite of expensive fish taste like ash. She lifted her wine glass, the third and final sip she allowed herself, and in the motion her gaze drifted across the dining room toward the service alcove. Through the gap between tables, past the servers moving with choreographed efficiency, she saw them. The man from earlier, the one who'd taken her order with professional courtesy and eyes that looked tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. And next to him, a boy in a paper Santa hat, small and careful in the way children became when they'd learned too early that the world required them to take up less space. Between them sat something small, a candle flickering in the warm air, and their faces were lit with a joy so pure and uncomplicated it felt like witnessing something holy. Elena's knife slipped from her fingers and clattered against the plate, the sound lost in the ambient noise of the dining room, but deafening in her own ears. She couldn't look away from them, from the way the man's hand covered the boys, from the way they smiled at each other like they'd solved some fundamental equation that had always eluded her. They had nothing. She could see it in the man's worn clothing, in the cheap plastic table, in the smallness of whatever they were celebrating. But they had everything. They had each other. They had belonging. They had the things she'd spent 34 years chasing and never catching because she'd been looking in the wrong direction. Building empires when what she needed was someone to sit with her in the dark and light a candle and smile like she mattered. Something in Elena's chest cracked, a small sound like ice breaking on a frozen lake when spring first arrived. She set down her fork. The salmon remaining on her plate would go uneaten, waste that would get scraped into the trash while people existed in this city who were hungry. The irony wasn't lost on her, but knowing something was wrong didn't automatically provide knowledge of how to fix it. She was 34 years old and controlled assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars, but she couldn't remember the last time someone had genuinely wanted her company, had invited her to join, not because of what she could provide, but simply because they enjoyed her presence. 10 years. 10 years of Christmas dinners at this same table, eating the same meal, drinking the same wine, going home to the same empty penthouse and telling herself it was a choice, that solitude was preferable to the complications of human connection. that she'd built something valuable even if it couldn't hold her when the nights got long and the silence grew teeth. She'd been lying to herself, she understood now. The success was real, but so was the loneliness, and one hadn't canceled out the other. They'd coexisted, two truths running parallel, and she'd spent a decade pretending only one of them mattered. She lifted her hand, the gesture small and tentative. Claire, the young server who'd been assigned to her table, appeared instantly with the supernatural speed of restaurant workers who'd learned to read customer body language. 23 years old, working her way through nursing school, pleasant in the way servers were pleasant when they needed good tips, but had no genuine interest in the people they served. Elena didn't blame her for that. She'd been on the other side of that transaction too many times. The customer who demanded service while remaining fundamentally uninterested in the human providing it. Her voice came quieter than intended, uncertain in a way that would have shocked her board members. That man, in the alcove, is he a guest? Claire followed Elena's gaze, taking a moment to identify who she meant. That's Marcus. He works here, server and maintenance. That's Dylan, his son. The information landed with more weight than it should have. Not a guest, an employee. Someone who worked in this building, whose livelihood depended on decisions made by people like her, whose existence she'd never considered beyond the 30 seconds it took him to bring her salmon and inquire if she needed anything else. She'd looked at him earlier and seen a server, a function rather than a person, and now she understood with sudden visceral clarity how dehumanization worked. Not through active cruelty, but through passive indifference, through systems that let you benefit from someone's labor while remaining carefully ignorant of their circumstances. The words left her mouth before she could calculate their wisdom. Does he often bring his son to work? Claire's expression shifted slightly, moving from professional neutrality towards something softer. Only holidays. He's a single dad. Can't afford a sitter, I think. Gloria lets him as long as Dylan stays out of sight. Single father. Couldn't afford childcare. Bringing his son to work on Christmas Eve because the alternative was leaving him alone or missing a shift, and missing a shift meant missing rent or missing groceries or missing something else that mattered when your margin for error was measured in dollars rather than thousands. Elena felt something twist in her gut, recognition mixed with shame. She'd approved cost-cutting measures that morning that would make lives like his harder, had nodded once in approval of policies that would eliminate the exact kind of flexibility Gloria was showing. And she'd done it without thinking about faces or names, or 7-year-old boys in paper Santa hats eating cupcakes in service alcoves. She stood abruptly, the movement sudden enough that Claire stepped back in alarm. "Miss Whitmore, is everything all right?" The question had no good answer. Nothing was all right. She was 34 years old and successful by every metric that mattered to the world, and completely alone, and suddenly urgently aware that those facts were connected. That her success had been built on the careful maintenance of distance between herself and other humans. That empire building required you to see people as resources rather than persons. And she'd gotten so good at it, she'd forgotten how to do anything else. Her voice came steadier than she felt. "I need to speak with him." Claire's concern deepened. With Marcus? Did he do something wrong? The assumption landed like a blow. Of course, that would be the first thought. Rich customer wants to speak to employee. Must be a complaint. Must be a problem. Elena understood suddenly how power worked, how her mere presence created fear in people who couldn't afford to displease her, who lived in a state of permanent precarity where one complaint could mean termination. One termination could mean eviction. One eviction could mean the kind of spiral from which recovery became impossible. Her words came firm, definitive. "No, nothing wrong." She walked across the dining room before she could talk herself out of it, before calculation could overtake impulse, before the part of her brain that had kept her successful and isolated could reassert control. Her heels clicked against hardwood floor, the sound marking each step towards something she couldn't name but desperately needed. A few heads turned as she passed, recognition flickering in some faces. She wasn't famous in the way actors or athletes were famous, but in certain circles, her face appeared often enough that people who followed business news might recognize her. She'd spent years cultivating that recognition, understanding that reputation mattered in real estate, that being known as tough and uncompromising gave her advantages in negotiations. Now that reputation felt like a cage, each article written about her ruthlessness adding another bar, until she'd built a prison so secure even she couldn't escape. The irony was that she'd done it to herself, that every decision to prioritize profit over people, every time she'd chosen spreadsheets over sympathy, had been her own choice. No one had forced her to become this. She'd done it willingly, believing it was necessary for success. And maybe it had been necessary, but the cost was becoming unbearable. Marcus looked up as she approached. He was in the process of putting the candle back in his pocket, his hands moving with the economy of motion that came from years of doing small tasks efficiently. Dylan held the remains of the cupcake in both hands, careful not to smudge the frosting, chocolate on his upper lip in a way that made him look impossibly young. For a moment, Marcus's face showed confusion, then worry. In his experience, when someone from the dining room approached him, it meant a complaint about service or a request for something else or some violation of the invisible rules that governed the space between customers and workers. He stood quickly, the folding chair scraping against linoleum, and his voice came professionally neutral. "Can I help you with something, ma'am?" Elena stopped 3 feet away, close enough to see the wear in his shirt collar where the fabric had been mended with stitches, too careful to be professional tailoring, close enough to notice the tiredness around his eyes that went deeper than a single late shift. Up close, he looked both older and younger than she'd thought, worn down by circumstances but not broken, carrying weight but not crushed beneath it. She opened her mouth to speak and found the words she'd prepared, something polite and distant, would not come. Instead, she heard herself say, "Are you celebrating Christmas?" Dylan looked at his father, then at the woman, his face moving through uncertainty before settling on politeness. "Yes, ma'am." The formality of it, the way this 7-year-old boy had been taught to say ma'am to adults, to show respect to people who existed above him, in hierarchies he was too young to understand but had already learned to navigate, undid something in Elena. She felt her eyes sting, moisture gathering that she blinked away rapidly because she did not cry, had not cried in years, had trained herself out of that particular display of weakness. But the tears came anyway, disobedient and honest, and she understood she was standing at a crossroads between the person she'd become and the person she might still choose to be. Her voice came quieter than she'd intended, vulnerable in a way that would have horrified her board members. "It looks lovely." Marcus's posture relaxed slightly, the tension in his shoulders easing. "Thank you. We were just finishing up." The words were dismissal, polite but clear, and Elena recognized them as such. He was trying to protect this moment, to keep his small celebration private from the intrusion of someone who represented everything wrong with the world, someone whose presence here was fundamentally inappropriate regardless of intention. She should leave. She knew she should leave. But her mouth opened, and the words that came out surprised even her. "I don't mean to intrude, but I was wondering—" She stopped. This was absurd. She was a woman who negotiated billion-dollar deals without flinching, who'd built an empire on calculated risks and strategic decisions, and she could not ask a simple question of a man who earned minimum wage and his 7-year-old son. The paralysis felt complete, the gap between what she wanted and what she could request too vast to cross. She turned to leave, apology forming on her lips, but Dylan's voice stopped her. Clear and certain, the way children spoke before the world taught them to be suspicious. "You can sit with us. We have an extra chair." He pointed to the third folding chair, leaning against the wall, his expression open and guileless, offering inclusion with the casual generosity of someone who'd never been taught that kindness could be weaponized. Elena looked at the boy, at his paper Santa hat and chocolate-smudged face, and the way he smiled at her like she was just another person, rather than a CEO or a building owner, or someone whose decisions could destroy his father's livelihood. She felt her chest constrict with emotion she didn't have names for, gratitude and shame, and something that might have been hope if hope weren't such a dangerous thing to feel. Marcus glanced at his son, then at Elena, and something shifted in his expression. He saw something in her face that he recognized, that he'd seen in his own mirror on mornings when Dylan was still asleep and the apartment was too quiet, and loneliness felt like physical pressure against his chest. His voice came slowly, cautiously, a man making a decision he couldn't quite justify but couldn't quite refuse. It's not much, but you're welcome to join us. Elena's breath caught. She'd expected rejection, had prepared herself for it, had already begun constructing the retreat back to table 17 in the familiar comfort of isolation. But he was offering inclusion, this man who had every reason to resent her and no reason to show her kindness. She managed to nod, not trusting her voice, and Marcus unfolded the third chair with movements that suggested this was not quite real, that he was moving through a dream where normal rules had been temporarily suspended. The alcove was small, meant for one person on break or two if they were friendly. With three people, their knees nearly touched beneath a plastic table that could barely hold a cupcake and Dylan's notebook. But Elena sat as if it were the finest seat she'd ever occupied, the cashmere sweater that cost $800 pressed against a folding chair that probably cost $12, and the juxtaposition felt like commentary on every choice she'd made in her adult life. Dylan, ever the host, pushed what remained of the cupcake toward her. Would you like some? Elena looked at the damaged frosting, the chocolate cake that had been marked down because it wasn't perfect enough to sell at full price, and felt something break inside her chest. She'd eaten at Michelin-starred restaurants where single meals cost more than this man probably earned in a day, had consumed food prepared by chefs whose names appeared in magazines, and none of it had ever tasted like anything more than fuel. But this cupcake, offered by a child who understood scarcity in ways she'd spent her adult life trying to ignore, felt like the most valuable thing she'd ever been offered. Her voice came thick with emotion she couldn't control. I couldn't. That's yours. Dylan's response came with the simple wisdom of children who'd been taught important truths. Dad says sharing makes things better. Elena looked at Marcus. He shrugged, a small movement that said he'd taught his son this because it was true, because in a world where you had very little, sharing was how you created abundance, how you transformed scarcity into community. She carefully broke off a small piece of the cupcake, the smallest piece possible, afraid of taking too much from people who had too little. The frosting was too sweet, the kind of sweetness that came from cheap ingredients and industrial production. But it tasted like something more. It tasted like belonging. For 20 minutes, they sat in that small space between worlds, and Dylan talked. He told her about school, about the snowflake craft he'd made in art class, about Mrs. Patterson who let him read chapter books during quiet time because he was advanced for his age. He told her about the classroom hamster who'd escaped and been found sleeping in the principal's inbox. He told her about his drawings, showing her the notebook with careful pride, explaining each image with the seriousness of an artist presenting a portfolio. Marcus sat quietly, watching his son with the kind of attention that made clear this child was the center of his universe, the fixed point around which everything else revolved. Elena asked questions, genuine questions born from actual interest rather than polite performance, and laughed when Dylan described the hamster's expression when discovered in the inbox. She felt something loosening in her chest, some knot that had been pulled tight for so long she'd forgotten it was there. For the first time in a decade, she forgot she was a CEO, forgot she owned buildings in 7 states, forgot that her calendar was booked 3 months in advance. She was just a woman sitting at a folding table with a father and son, eating shared cupcake, listening to a 7-year-old boy talk about his life, and it felt like coming home to a place she'd never been. Then someone recognized her. It happened quickly, the way these things always did. A man from table 8 stood to use the restroom, walked past the alcove, and did a double take that would have been comical if it weren't so destructive. His voice came too loud, carrying across the sudden hush that fell. Miss Whitmore, I thought that was you. Elena recognized him vaguely, an investor she'd met at some conference where men in expensive suits had asked her aggressive questions disguised as compliments. His face carried the particular smugness of people who believed their recognition conferred status on those they recognized. She looked up from where she sat wedged between Marcus and Dylan, the three of them crowded around a table meant for solitary meals, and felt the moment crystallize into something that would shatter everything. The man's voice carried enthusiasm that sounded like accusation. Having dinner with the staff? That's very generous of you. The word generous hung in the air like indictment. Around them, conversations stuttered then resumed at lower volumes. That peculiar shift that meant people were now listening while pretending not to. Elena saw phones come out at neighboring tables, not raised for obvious photographs, but held at angles that suggested discreet documentation. The man's wife leaned toward the couple at the adjacent table, whispering with the urgency of someone sharing classified information. Within seconds, screens glowed as people Googled her name, verified what they'd heard, began constructing narratives about what they were witnessing. Marcus noticed the phones first. His entire body tensed, shoulders drawing up in defensive posture that came from years of understanding how quickly situations could deteriorate when you had no power to control them. He saw the way people angled their cameras, the way whispers spread like contagion through the dining room, and understood with sick certainty that something private had just become public. His stomach dropped as the implications cascaded. This woman wasn't just another customer. She was Elena Whitmore, the Elena Whitmore, the woman whose name appeared in business sections above words like ruthless and acquisition, and according to the gossip he'd overheard, the woman who'd just purchased the building that housed his livelihood. Gloria emerged from the kitchen, her face tight with concern that bordered on panic. She'd managed restaurants long enough to recognize when situations required intervention, and the way the dining room had shifted from celebration to spectacle triggered every alarm her experience had installed. She approached the alcove with quick steps that tried to look casual, her eyes moving between Elena and Marcus and the phones that had multiplied like hydra heads, each one documenting this moment for purposes she couldn't control and Marcus couldn't afford. Her voice came low, meant only for Marcus. Everything okay here? The question had no good answer. Marcus looked at Gloria, saw the fear in her eyes that mirrored his own, and understood that this moment would have consequences that extended beyond tonight. His boss was asking if he was okay, while his actual boss sat 3 feet away, and the power dynamics of that arrangement suddenly felt like standing on ground that was crumbling beneath him. He stood abruptly, the folding chair scraping against linoleum with a screech that cut through the ambient noise. The words left his mouth harder than intended, sharp enough to wound. Did you think this was amusing? Elena stood as well, her face draining of color as she recognized what was happening, how the moment had transformed from connection to spectacle. She reached towards him, a gesture of connection or apology or something she couldn't name. But Marcus stepped back like her touch might burn. His voice came louder now, fueled by fear disguised as anger. Slumming it with the working class on Christmas Eve? Is this some story you'll tell at your next board meeting? The time you ate cupcakes with the help? Dylan shrank back in his chair, the paper Santa hat sliding forward as if it could hide him from the sudden violence of adult emotions. He looked between his father and the woman who'd seemed so kind moments ago, trying to understand how things had shifted so quickly from warmth to this. The confusion on his face was its own kind of devastation. Elena's voice came desperate, trying to reach through Marcus's defenses. No, that's not. But Marcus was past hearing, past rationality, operating on instincts honed by years of understanding that people with power use people without it for entertainment, for image management, for whatever purposes suited them. His words came fast and cutting. Then what was it? You own this building. You know everyone here is talking. You know what this looks like. Around them, the dining room had gone fully quiet, conversations abandoned in favor of witnessing whatever drama was unfolding. Phones recorded openly now, no longer bothering with discretion. Elena could feel the weight of all those eyes, all those lenses, documenting her humiliation with the kind of attention that would follow her into tomorrow and next week and possibly forever. Because the internet never forgot, and wealthy people being taken down by workers they'd wronged was the kind of story that spread with viral intensity. She reached for her purse, the instinct so deeply trained it operated without conscious thought. Write a check, smooth things over with money, turn human connection into transaction, because that was the language she spoke fluently, the only vocabulary she'd mastered for navigating emotional terrain that remained otherwise incomprehensible. But Marcus's expression stopped her mid-motion, his face showing exactly what he thought of that particular solution. His words came quieter now, but no less devastating. I don't want your charity. I don't want your pity. I want... He stopped, awareness crashing over him that Dylan was listening, that his son was watching him treat someone with cruelty that would require explanation later, that he was modeling exactly the kind of behavior he'd always taught Dylan to avoid. His voice dropped to something that approached neutral, but couldn't quite reach it. I think you should go. Elena looked at Dylan, at the child who'd offered her cupcake and inclusion without hesitation, who'd smiled at her like she was just another person rather than a threat or a resource or something to be managed. The boy sat motionless now, the hat clutched in small fists, his face showing the kind of adult disappointment that children should never have to learn. She'd come here seeking connection and instead had brought chaos into the one corner of this building where something genuine had existed, however briefly. Her voice came barely audible, a whisper that contained more genuine emotion than any presentation she'd delivered in a boardroom. I'm sorry. Then she turned and walked away. The dining room remained silent as she crossed it, every eye tracking her progress toward the hostess stand where she'd left her coat. The pianist had stopped playing. Servers stood frozen mid-stride. The only sound was the click of her heels against hardwood and the ambient hum of the building's heating system. Mechanical breath that continued regardless of human drama, unfolding within its walls. She collected her coat without looking at the hostess, pushed through the front door into December cold that hit like physical assault. The sidewalk stretched empty in both directions, pools of light from street lamps creating islands in the darkness. Her breath misted in air that smelled like snow and car exhaust in the particular loneliness of cities at night. She stood there for 30 seconds that felt like hours, her phone clutched in one hand before realizing she was crying. Not the careful tears she'd allowed herself in private moments when the weight of isolation became briefly unbearable before being packed away again. These were the deep, wrenching sobs that came from places she'd walled off so thoroughly she'd forgotten they existed. The kind of crying that shook her entire body and made it impossible to maintain the composed exterior that had protected her for decades. She'd just experienced genuine human connection for the first time in years, and she'd destroyed it, or it had been destroyed, or maybe it had never been real in the first place, and she'd been delusional to think that someone like her could sit at folding tables with people like them. Her car service appeared within minutes of her summons, the black sedan pulling to the curb with the quiet efficiency of services that catered to people who paid premium rates for reliability. The driver didn't comment on her tears or ask if she was all right, trained in the discretion that wealthy clients required. She climbed into the back seat that smelled like leather and air freshener and watched through tinted windows as families exited the restaurant behind her. Children bundled in coats, parents holding hands, everyone moving toward cars and homes and lives that included other people. She was surrounded by the city, but utterly alone despite the driver 6 feet away. And the paradox of urban isolation had never felt more complete. Back in the alcove, Marcus sat with his head in his hands, elbows pressed against the plastic table that still held crumbs from the cupcake they'd shared. His breathing came short and rapid, the physical response to adrenaline that had nowhere to go now that the confrontation had ended. Gloria approached with the caution of someone approaching wounded animals, her face carrying sympathy mixed with the harder calculation of managers who had to think about liability and public relations and all the unsexy logistics that followed dramatic incidents. Her words came gentle but direct. You okay? Marcus couldn't look at her. I'm fine. You want to take the rest of the night off? The question was kindness masquerading as suggestion. Leave before this gets worse. Go home before someone files a complaint. Protect yourself by removing yourself from the situation. But Marcus knew the arithmetic of hourly wages and rent due and groceries needed, knew that leaving early meant money he couldn't afford to lose regardless of emotional justification. His response came automatic. I need the hours. Gloria nodded once, understanding passing between them without requiring elaboration, and walked away. Marcus listened to her footsteps fade and felt the crushing weight of what he'd just done settle across his shoulders. He'd attacked someone who'd shown his son kindness. He'd humiliated someone in public based on assumptions that might be wrong. He'd let fear and pride override judgment, and now he'd have to live with whatever consequences followed. Dylan tugged his sleeve with the tentative touch of children who've learned to approach adult emotions carefully. Dad, why did you yell at her? The question was accusation disguised as inquiry. Marcus heard the disappointment beneath the words, the confusion of a child who'd watched his father violate the very principles he taught. He forced himself to look at his son, to see the paper Santa hat now crumpled and slightly torn, the chocolate still smudged on his upper lip, the open face that hadn't yet learned to hide its feelings behind protective layers. His voice came hollow. I didn't yell. You were mad. The observation hung between them. Marcus wanted to deny it, to construct elaborate explanations about power dynamics and class conflict and all the adult complexities that justified his reaction. But Dylan was 7, and those explanations would sound like excuses, which is what they were. He'd been mad, and mad had made him mean, and mean had driven away someone who'd seemed genuinely lonely. His admission came reluctant. I thought she was making fun of us. Dylan's response contained the absolute certainty of childhood, the clarity that hadn't yet been compromised by adult cynicism. She wasn't making fun, she was lonely. The words landed like stones thrown through windows, shattering Marcus's careful construction of justified anger. He replayed the interaction in his mind, watching it from different angles now that rage had subsided enough to permit perspective. The way Elena's hands had shaken when she'd asked to join them. How she'd listened to Dylan's stories like they mattered more than anything else in the world. The smallest piece of cupcake, taken with such care, it had seemed like she was afraid of taking too much from people who had too little. Her voice when she talked about boarding school and parents who were always traveling and learning early that love had to be earned through achievement. Not judgment in her eyes, just hope. Just desperate, vulnerable hope that maybe this time would be different. His throat tightened with realization. I think you're right. Well, Dylan's next question came soft but devastating. Then why did she leave? Marcus closed his eyes against the answer he couldn't avoid. Because I made her feel bad. You should say sorry. The suggestion was simple the way children's solutions were simple. Operating from moral clarity uncompromised by considerations of pride or power, or the complicated arithmetic that made apologies feel like admissions of weakness rather than demonstrations of strength. Marcus wanted to explain why he couldn't apologize, why the woman who owned this building and had probably forgotten about them already wouldn't want to hear from the server who'd embarrassed her in public. But even as he constructed those rationalizations, he recognized them as cowardice dressed in practical clothing. His voice came quiet, defeated. I don't think I'll get the chance. The rest of his shift passed in mechanical progression. He cleared tables without seeing the people sitting at them. He refilled water glasses with hands that moved through muscle memory while his mind remained stuck in the alcove, replaying the moment when connection had shattered into spectacle. Other servers avoided him, their distance suggesting that word had spread about his confrontation with Elena Whitmore, that he'd just publicly humiliated someone important, that he might have cost himself his job through spectacular miscalculation of social dynamics he should have navigated more carefully. Miguel caught him in the service corridor between the kitchen and the dining room, pulling him aside with a grip on his elbow that was gentle but insistent. His face showed concern mixed with the particular frustration of watching someone you care about make destructive choices. Hermano, you know who that was? You just told off Elena Whitmore. Marcus felt sick. I know. People are saying she just bought this building, that she's planning major changes, and you... Miguel stopped, shaking his head. Man, I hope you're looking at backup jobs. The assessment was harsh but probably accurate. Marcus had just publicly confronted his ultimate boss, had humiliated her in front of customers who documented everything with phones that would ensure this moment lived forever on the internet. Even if Elena wasn't vindictive, the practical reality was that he'd made himself a liability, someone whose continued employment created awkwardness that management would eventually decide wasn't worth whatever value his labor provided. Dylan fell asleep in the alcove around 10:30, his head pillowed on arms crossed atop the plastic table, the paper Santa hat sliding to one side. Marcus watched his son sleep and felt the familiar cocktail of fierce love and desperate inadequacy. This child trusted him completely, believed in him without reservation, And Marcus kept proving himself unworthy of that faith through decisions that prioritized pride over wisdom, anger over compassion. How many times would Dylan have to watch his father choose wrong before that trust eroded into something harder? At 11:45, Gloria told him he could leave. The restaurant would close at midnight, staff would clean and prep for tomorrow, but Marcus's presence wasn't required for that final hour. The kindness was obvious, even if the motivation remained ambiguous. Get him out before something else happened. Remove the problem from the equation before it complicated further. He carried Dylan to the employee area where their coats hung on hooks designated for staff, bundling his son in the winter coat that was good but not great, serviceable but not perfect. When he returned to the dining room to leave through the front entrance, he stopped. Elena Whitmore stood near table 17, not sitting but standing with her coat buttoned and her purse clutched in both hands like she'd been waiting. The restaurant was nearly empty, now last few servers stacking chairs with the resigned efficiency of people at the end of long shifts. The pianist was gone. The candles had been extinguished. Only the overhead lights remained, harsh and unforgiving, making everything look cheaper and more worn than it had appeared under atmospheric illumination. Marcus approached slowly, Dylan heavy and warm against his shoulder. Elena turned at the sound of his footsteps, and he saw her eyes were red, mascara slightly smudged in a way that suggested she'd cried hard and recently. The sight of that imperfection, that evidence of genuine emotion from someone who'd seemed so composed hours earlier, shifted something in his chest. Her voice came before he could speak. I came back to apologize. You don't need to. I do. She took a breath that shook slightly. I'm sorry for putting you in that position. I wasn't thinking about how it would look. Marcus sat Dylan down gently in a nearby chair, the boy stirring but not waking, and turned to face Elena fully. The space between them contained all the complicated geography of class and power and the ways humans hurt each other through indifference or intention or the terrible combination of both. He saw her now, really saw her, and recognized in her face the same loneliness he confronted in his mirror on mornings when Dylan was still asleep and the apartment was too quiet and the future looked like infinite repetition of barely getting by. His words came quiet but certain. I'm the one who should apologize. I accused you of things that weren't true. You were protecting your son. That's not something to apologize for. They stood in the near-empty restaurant, two people from different worlds who'd found themselves in the same moment of recognition, seeing in each other the mirror of their own isolation. Elena's fingers twisted around the strap of her purse, nervous gesture from someone who probably hadn't felt nervous in years. Marcus kept his hands in his pockets because he didn't know what else to do with them, didn't know the protocol for apologizing to someone who could destroy your life with a phone call. Elena's voice came smaller than before. I saw you with your son, and I wanted to feel that, just for a minute. She paused, gathering courage for admission that clearly cost her. I wanted to know what it was like to be part of something. The confession hung between them, raw and honest, and so vulnerable that Marcus felt his defenses crumble. He'd spent the last hour constructing elaborate justifications for his anger, convincing himself that he'd been protecting Dylan from being someone's charity case or photo opportunity. But standing here now, seeing the naked hope and fear on Elena's face, he understood he'd been wrong. Not wrong to worry about power dynamics or exploitation, but wrong about her intentions. Wrong about assuming the worst when she'd been offering the best thing she knew how to offer. Herself, her presence, her desperate desire not to be alone on Christmas Eve. Dylan woke up and rubbed his eyes, taking in the scene with the quick assessment of children who'd learned to read rooms accurately. His face brightened when he saw Elena, the smile emerging before adult considerations about awkwardness or social convention could complicate his reaction. He reached into his coat pocket, that motion suggesting preparation and forethought, and pulled out the paper Santa hat that had been on his head earlier. The hat looked worse now, wrinkled and slightly torn, the cotton ball hanging by threads that wouldn't survive much longer. But Dylan held it out to Elena with the seriousness of children presenting treasured possessions, his voice clear and certain. You forgot this. Elena stared at the hat like it was something infinitely precious, rather than something constructed from craft paper and glue by a 7-year-old in a public school art class. Her voice came thick with emotion she didn't try to hide. I didn't. Dylan interrupted with the gentle insistence of someone who'd already decided what needed to happen. I made it for you so you could be part of our Christmas party. Elena took the hat with hands that shook visibly. She turned it over, examining the crooked staples and the way the construction paper had been folded with careful but imperfect precision, and something in her face broke. She brought the hat to her chest, holding it against cashmere that cost $800, and then she cried. Not the careful tears from earlier, or the controlled sobs in the car, but deep, wrenching sounds that came from a place she'd locked away for decades, the kind of crying that shook her entire body and made it impossible to maintain any pretense of composure. She covered her face with her hands, ashamed of the rawness of it, horrified at losing control so completely in front of people she barely knew. But Dylan got up and hugged her waist with the uncomplicated affection of children who hadn't yet learned that physical comfort required permission or invitation. Marcus stepped forward, awkward but genuine, and put a hand on her shoulder. The three of them stood like that, Marcus's hand warmed through Elena's coat, Dylan's arms wrapped around her waist, Elena sobbing into her hands while holding a paper Santa hat like it was the most valuable thing she'd ever been given. When the worst of Elena's crying subsided, when the Saz had gentled into hitching breaths and sniffles she couldn't quite control, she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and looked at them both. Her mascara was fully ruined now, dark smudges beneath her eyes that made her look younger and more vulnerable than the put-together CEO who'd walked into the restaurant hours earlier. Her words came halting, uncertain. I don't know how to do this. Marcus understood she wasn't talking about apologizing or making amends, but something larger, something that encompassed connection and vulnerability and all the messy, complicated work of letting people matter. His response came from the same place of honesty. None of us really do. We just try. Elena looked at him, really looked at him, seeing past server and employee to the person who'd built a life around his son, despite every obstacle that tried to break them. She could see the exhaustion in his face, the weight he carried, the pride that had made him lash out earlier when he'd felt threatened. But she could also see the gentleness, the way he'd taught his son to share and be kind and offer inclusion to strangers who needed it. This man had very little by material measures, but he'd built something she'd spent 34 years failing to construct. A life that mattered, a connection that sustained, love that existed without conditions or calculations. Her next words came quiet but determined. Can I tell you something? Of course. I grew up in boarding schools. Parents were always traveling, always busy. The story came slowly, each sentence requiring effort, like she was excavating artifacts from places she deliberately buried. She told them about learning that love had to be earned through achievement, about straight A's and awards, and the particular loneliness of succeeding at everything while mattering to no one. She told them about her father's new family and her mother's birthday cards that arrived weeks late, and the grandmother who'd loved her without conditions, but who died when Elena was 14, leaving behind a silence that still echoed. She told them about building an empire because empires were measurable and controllable, because success had rules, and if you followed them, you could construct something that looked like fulfillment, even if it felt hollow. Her voice broke on the final admission. But tonight, sitting with you both, I realized something. You can't earn belonging. It's just given, or it's not. Marcus felt recognition settle in his chest, the understanding that came from seeing your own story reflected in someone else's experience. He told her about Jenna leaving when Dylan was 2, about choosing his son over the better-paying job that required travel, about learning to budget in ways that would have seemed impossible before, but which had become second nature. He told her about the constant arithmetic of poverty, the calculations of what they could afford to lose, the way every decision required weighing competing necessities. He told her about the walls he'd built to protect them both, walls that had become so thick he sometimes couldn't tell where protection ended and prison began. His voice came quiet but certain on the final thought. You're right, it's not earned, it's just there, if you're lucky enough to find it. Dylan looked between them, understanding passing across his face, even though the words had been aimed at adult ears. His question came with the directness of children who hadn't yet learned that some questions were better left unasked. So are we friends now? Elena looked at this boy who'd given her a paper Santa hat and told her she could be part of his Christmas party, this child who'd offered inclusion without hesitation or calculation, who'd seen her loneliness and responded with kindness rather than judgment. She looked at his father, who'd been angry and hurt and protective, but who'd also come back to apologize, who'd been vulnerable enough to admit his mistakes. And she felt something shift in her chest, some possibility opening that she thought was closed forever. Her response came through tears that hadn't fully stopped. "I'd like that very much." Marcus pulled them both into an embrace that was awkward and genuine, the three of them standing in the nearly empty restaurant under harsh overhead lights that made everything visible and nothing beautiful. But in that moment, ugliness didn't matter. Only connection mattered. Only the fragile, imperfect, desperately needed reality of not being alone. They stood together, these three people who barely knew each other, connected by the simplest and most profound of human needs, the need to be seen, to be valued, to belong to something larger than isolation. The moment held for 10 seconds before Marcus felt his phone vibrate in his pocket, insistent buzzing that suggested multiple notifications arriving in rapid succession. He pulled back enough to check the screen, confusion crossing his face as he saw the notifications. Text messages from numbers he didn't recognize, Twitter mentions, Instagram tags. His face went pale as the understanding dawned. Someone had posted photos from earlier. The moment in the alcove, his confrontation with Elena. Everything had been documented and shared and was now spreading across the internet with the viral intensity that came when stories touched something people cared about. Rich CEO, poor worker, Christmas Eve confrontation. The narrative practically wrote itself. He looked at Elena and she looked back, and they both understood simultaneously that whatever had just begun between them would now unfold under scrutiny they couldn't control, documented and discussed and judged by strangers who knew nothing about what had actually happened, but who would have strong opinions anyway. The private had become public, and there was no taking it back. The parking lot stretched empty under streetlights that turned falling snow into columns of gold. Marcus stood beside his Honda Civic, Dylan heavy against his shoulder, while Elena waited by the black sedan idling at the curb. The space between them held all the complicated arithmetic of what happened next, how private moments survive public exposure, whether fragile connections could withstand the weight of attention neither had invited. Elena's phone buzzed in her hand, the screen illuminating her face with harsh light. She glanced at it, then looked back at Marcus. It's already everywhere. Photos, commentary. People have opinions about something they didn't witness and don't understand. Marcus shifted Dylan's weight, feeling the boy's breath warm against his neck. What are they saying? Half think it's heartwarming, the other half think it's a publicity stunt. The assessment captured the impossible position they'd found themselves in. Whatever they did next would be interpreted through lenses neither could control, reduced to narratives that served other people's need for simple stories in a world that offered mostly complications. Marcus felt exhaustion settle across his shoulders, the kind that went beyond physical tiredness into something that touched bone and spirit. His voice came rough. "I'm sorry you got dragged into this." Elena looked at him with an expression that contained surprise and something softer. "You're apologizing to me? I walked into your life uninvited. I made your private moment public just by being there. You didn't make it public. Someone with a phone did." Same result. They stood in silence, broken only by the idle of Elena's car and the distant sound of the city continuing its Christmas Eve despite their small crisis. Dylan stirred against Marcus's shoulder but didn't wake, his breathing maintaining the steady rhythm of deep sleep. Elena watched the boy with an expression Marcus couldn't quite read, something between longing and regret and a tenderness that looked unpracticed, like she was learning a language she'd never been taught. She pulled a business card from her purse, hesitated, then wrote on the back with pen that materialized from somewhere in her expensive coat. "This is my personal number, the one that doesn't go through assistance or get screened by anyone else." Marcus took the card, the paper thick and embossed, the kind that announced importance before you even read what it said. He pulled a napkin from his pocket, the paper thin and already slightly damp from snow, and wrote his number with a pen borrowed from Elena. The exchange felt absurd and perfect. CEO and server swapping contact information on materials that spoke to the gap between their worlds. Elena's fingers brushed his as she took the napkin, contact that lasted half a second but felt created with intention. I'd like to see you again, both of you, if that's something you'd want. Marcus heard the uncertainty in her voice, the vulnerability of someone unused to asking for things she couldn't guarantee. He thought about the internet commentary and the complicated logistics and all the reasons this was a terrible idea. Then he thought about Dylan saying she was lonely, about the way she'd cried while holding a paper Santa hat, about the possibility that sometimes terrible ideas were the only honest ones. His response came careful, but certain. Yeah, I think that would be good. Elena smiled, and the expression transformed her face into something younger and more open than the composed CEO who'd sat at table 17 hours earlier. She got into her car without further words, the door closing with the expensive thunk of German engineering, and Marcus watched the sedan pull away into falling snow. He stood there for another minute, Dylan warm against him, holding a business card that felt like both promise and complication, before finally opening his own car door and beginning the drive home to their apartment where rent was due in 6 days and the refrigerator held milk that would expire tomorrow, and life continued regardless of whatever had just shifted. Christmas morning arrived with Dylan bouncing on the pull-out couch where Marcus slept, energy undiminished by late night or disrupted schedule. The apartment was small, one bedroom that Dylan occupied while Marcus made do with the couch that converted into something approximating a bed. The space smelled like the coffee Marcus had started brewing at 5:30 when sleep proved impossible, his mind replaying the previous night until the memories wore grooves he couldn't escape. Dylan tore into presents with the enthusiasm of children who'd been taught to be grateful for whatever they received. A puzzle from the thrift store, pieces checked carefully to ensure none were missing. A book about trains purchased used from the shop near the library. Socks, because socks were practical, and Dylan needed them, and sometimes practical mattered more than exciting. The boy held up each gift with genuine delight, and Marcus felt his chest constrict with the familiar cocktail of love and inadequacy. His son deserved more than secondhand puzzles and used books, deserved the kind of Christmas morning where surprises came wrapped in store paper and abundance was assumed rather than carefully calculated. Dylan paused in his unwrapping to look at his father with the directness that children brought to questions adults spent lifetimes avoiding. Dad, why were you so scared last night? The question landed with precision. Marcus had hoped Dylan hadn't noticed, that the fear had been internal rather than visible. But children who'd learned to read adult emotions for survival purposes missed very little. He sat beside his son on the pull-out couch that hadn't been fully converted back to seating position. Springs creaking under his weight, his answer came slowly, trying to find truth that was honest without being frightening. When those people were looking at us, I got scared they were judging us, that they thought we weren't good enough to be around someone like Elena. That's dumb. The assessment was definitive. Marcus felt something loosen in his chest. Yeah, it is. She liked us. I could tell. Dylan's certainty carried the weight of uncomplicated observation. Adults complicated things with assumptions and fears and the accumulated weight of past wounds. But children sometimes saw clearly precisely because they hadn't yet learned all the ways to be wrong. Marcus pulled his son into a hug that Dylan tolerated for exactly 10 seconds before squirming free to examine his new puzzle, already planning where he'd build it, how the pieces would fit together to create something complete. Marcus's phone sat on the counter charging, the screen showing 47 notifications he hadn't checked because he'd been afraid of what he'd find. Now, with coffee finished and Dylan occupied, he forced himself to scroll through them. Most were from numbers he didn't recognize, messages that ranged from supportive to hostile to bizarrely personal. Strangers felt entitled to opinions about his life, his choices, his fitness as a parent. The attention felt like exposure, like being naked in public while people critiqued your body and found it wanting. But buried among the noise were messages from people who mattered. Miguel checking if he was okay, Gloria letting him know his next shift wasn't canceled, that whatever consequences would follow, immediate termination wasn't among them. And one text from Elena, sent at 6 in the morning, suggesting she didn't sleep much either. Thank you for last night, for giving me a chance. I won't waste it. Marcus read the message 3 times, looking for subtext or manipulation, or the kind of performative sincerity that wealthy people deployed when managing their images. But the words felt genuine, bare of artifice. The kind of message written at dawn when defenses were low and honesty leaked through carefully maintained walls. He typed a response, deleted it, typed another, deleted that one too. Eventually settled on something simple that captured complicated truth. Thank you for coming back. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange limbo where Marcus waited for consequences that didn't arrive but felt perpetually imminent. He worked his shifts expecting every summons to Gloria's office to be termination, every interaction with management to be the moment when patience ran out and he was asked to collect his things and leave. But the termination never came. Gloria treated him normally, which is to say, with the distant professionalism of managers who couldn't afford to be friends with people they might need to fire. Other servers maintained cautious distance, unsure if he was hero or liability, whether association would help or hurt their own precarious positions. On January 2nd, Elena sat in her corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city she'd conquered through acquisition and negotiation, and the particular ruthlessness required to succeed in commercial real estate. The board meeting started at 9, scheduled for 2 hours but likely to run longer because Richardson, her CFO, had prepared a presentation that required defending cost-cutting measures she'd approved before Christmas and reconsidered since. The conference room held 12 people arranged around a table that cost more than Marcus's annual salary. Board members in expensive suits, executives who'd built careers on increasing shareholder value, consultants hired to provide opinions that supported predetermined conclusions. Elena sat at the head of the table with her laptop open to slides she'd prepared last night, working until 3 in the morning, because what she was about to propose would meet resistance, and resistance required overwhelming evidence. Richardson moved through his presentation with the confidence of someone who'd never had his authority questioned. Reduce staff benefits by eliminating paid sick leave. Increase commercial rents by 15% across all properties. Eliminate discretionary spending on building maintenance beyond legal minimums. The projections showed 12% profit increase within 18 months, numbers that board members nodded along to because numbers were clean and people were complicated, and it was easier to focus on what measured easily. When Richardson finished, he looked to Elena for the approval that had always come before, the single nod that turned proposals into policy. But Elena remained still, her hands folded on the table, her expression neutral in a way that made several board members shift uncomfortably. The silence extended past awkward into something that felt dangerous. Her voice came calm but carried an edge that made people sit straighter. I have an alternative proposal. She pulled up her own slides, prepared with the same care she'd brought to every important presentation in her career. But these numbers told a different story. Improve staff conditions instead of cutting them. Paid sick leave, health insurance, living wage. Cost analysis showing initial profit decrease of 12%, offset by reduced turnover, increased productivity, and the harder to quantify benefits of running businesses where people wanted to work rather than had to work. Richardson's face went red as he processed what she was suggesting. That will cost us millions. Long term, it saves money. And short term, we can absorb the cost. A board member, older white man who'd made his fortune in the 80s and considered every decade since a decline from that golden age, leaned forward with barely concealed hostility. Since when do you care about janitors and busboys? Elena felt something crystallize in her chest, clarity that came from knowing exactly who she wanted to be, even if it cost her everything she'd built. Her response came steady and certain. Since I learned they're the reason our properties function, since I understood that people aren't line items on a spreadsheet, they're human beings whose labor creates the value we extract. Since I decided that my grandmother, who cleaned houses to put herself through night school, deserved better than I've been giving people who do the same work now. The room went silent. Board members exchanged glances that communicated concern about their CEO's sudden attack of conscience, calculations about whether this was temporary aberration or a permanent problem. Richardson found his voice first, professional and cutting. "You're letting emotion influence business decisions." "No, for the first time in 10 years, I'm letting humanity guide them." The phrase hung in the air, challenge and declaration, and the line drawn that separated who she'd been from who she was choosing to become. The meeting devolved into arguments about fiduciary responsibility and shareholder value, and all the language deployed to justify prioritizing profit over people. But Elena held firm, using every negotiation skill she'd developed, every tactic she'd mastered, every bit of leverage her controlling interest provided. By noon, when they broke for lunch that no one wanted to eat, she'd won. The policy changes would proceed, staff would get benefits, rents would stay stable. It would cost her personally because her compensation was tied to profit margins, but that seemed appropriate. Consequences for choosing differently should be borne by the person making the choice. She returned to her office and called Marcus. The number she'd entered into her phone saved under his full name because informal diminutives felt presumptuous. He answered on the third ring, his voice carrying the ambient noise of somewhere public. Her words came before he could speak. "I did something today. I wanted you to know." She told him about the board meeting, about the policies she'd implemented, about choosing to run her business differently even if it cost her. She wasn't looking for praise or validation, just wanted him to understand that Christmas Eve had changed something fundamental. That connection had consequences that extended beyond the personal into the practical. Marcus listened without interrupting, processing implications he couldn't quite calculate. When she finished, his response came quiet. "Elena, you didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did. Not for you specifically. For everyone who works in buildings I own and deserves better than I've been giving. Still, thank you." The gratitude in his voice carried weight that numbers couldn't capture. The understanding that lives would be concretely better because of decisions she'd made in conference rooms he'd never enter. Elena felt something in her chest that might have been pride, or might have been the unfamiliar sensation of acting from values rather than calculation, of choosing right over profitable, and discovering the two weren't always opposed. She changed subjects before emotion could overwhelm her voice. "There's something else. Dylan mentioned a school concert next month. I was wondering if I could come." The request hung between them, weighted with implications about where this was going, what they were building, whether invitations to school concerts meant they were friends or something else or something that didn't have names yet. Marcus felt his throat tighten with the question he couldn't avoid. "You really want to sit in an elementary school cafeteria listening to 7-year-olds sing off-key?" "I really do." The sincerity was unmistakable. Marcus closed his eyes and made the decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. "Dylan would love that. Text me and I'll send you the details." February arrived with cold that felt personal, temperatures dropping below zero, and staying there with the stubbornness of winter that wouldn't yield to anyone's desire for spring. The elementary school cafeteria smelled like industrial cleaner and the ghost of 1,000 lunches. That particular scent that existed in every public school regardless of location or budget. Folding chairs had been arranged in rows facing a makeshift stage where children fidgeted in their assigned positions. Nervous energy barely contained by teachers who reminded them to stand still and smile and remember the words they'd been practicing for 6 weeks. Marcus sat in the third row, having arrived early to claim decent seats, and watched the door with anxiety that felt disproportionate to the situation. Elena had confirmed she was coming, but confirmation didn't guarantee arrival, and part of him wondered if this had been performative kindness that would evaporate when confronted with the reality of elementary school concerts and cafeterias that smelled like disinfectant and disappointment. But then she was there, pushing through the doors at 5 minutes before start time, wearing jeans and a sweater that probably still cost more than Marcus's monthly rent, but which looked deliberately casual, like she'd considered what to wear to a school concert and made conscious choice not to appear ostentatiously wealthy. She spotted him and smiled, the expression reaching her eyes in a way that made his heart do something complicated in his chest, and made her way through the crowd to the empty seat he'd saved beside him. Her voice came slightly breathless. I wasn't sure about parking. Had to circle twice. You made it. That's what matters. They sat in comfortable silence while the cafeteria filled with families, the noise level rising as children spotted parents and waved with enthusiasm that teachers tried to contain. Elena watched it all with an expression Marcus couldn't quite read, something between longing and pain, and a tenderness that looked like it might hurt. He wondered what she was thinking, whether she regretted coming, whether this was too much domesticity for someone whose life existed in conference rooms and corner offices. The concert began with the principal's welcome that went on too long, followed by the music teacher's explanation of the program that no one needed, and finally the children launched into their first song with enthusiasm that exceeded their pitch accuracy. Dylan stood in the front row, his voice blending with 30 other voices into something that approximated harmony, his face serious with concentration. Elena leaned forward in her chair, attention focused entirely on Dylan, and when he sang his brief solo, 2 lines about stars and dreams, she clapped louder than anyone else in the cafeteria, standing ovation that made other parents look over with curiosity. After the concert, when children flooded into the audience to find their families, Dylan launched himself at Elena with the unself-conscious affection of children who hadn't yet learned to guard their hearts. She caught him with a laugh that sounded surprised and delighted, holding him for a moment before setting him down to accept the program he thrust at her, his finger pointing to where his name appeared in small print. His voice came fast with excitement. Did you hear my solo? I didn't mess up even though I was nervous. Elena's response came with absolute sincerity. You were perfect. Best singer in the whole concert. That's not true. Sarah has better pitch, but thank you anyway. The honesty made Elena laugh again, this time with something that sounded like joy, uncomplicated and genuine. Marcus watched them together, watched Elena crouch down to Dylan's level to examine his program more closely, watched his son explain the songs they'd sung and why they'd chosen them, and felt something shift in his chest. This wasn't performance. This was someone genuinely interested in his son's life, showing up because it mattered, making space in a schedule that was probably packed with important meetings to sit in an elementary school cafeteria and applaud off-key singing. They went for pizza afterward, Dylan's choice of the cheap place 3 blocks from the school where slices were $2, and the ambiance was fluorescent lighting and plastic tables. Elena fit herself into the booth across from Marcus and Dylan, eating pizza that had gone slightly cold because they'd had to wait 15 minutes for a table, and participated in conversations about classroom hamsters and recess politics and all the minutiae of 7-year-old life that adults usually tuned out. She asked questions that suggested actual interest, remembered details Dylan had mentioned in previous conversations, made him feel heard in ways that required attention and care. When Dylan went to the bathroom, Elena and Marcus found themselves alone for the first time that evening. The space between them felt charged with possibility, the kind of moment where things could be said that would change what came after. Marcus studied her face, looking for signs of performance or obligation, but found only openness and something that might have been hope. His words came before he could overthink them. Thank you for coming tonight. It meant a lot to Dylan. Elena met his eyes and held the contact. It meant a lot to me. The admission hung between them, weighted with implications about what they were doing, where this was going, whether two people from such different worlds could build something real, or whether they were just postponing inevitable disappointment. Marcus felt his heart rate increase, awareness shifting from friendly to something else, something that made him notice details he'd been trying not to notice. The way Elena's hair fell across her face when she leaned forward, the laugh lines around her eyes when Dylan made her smile, the elegant bones in her hands that moved with grace even when handling cheap pizza. He reached across the table and took her hand, the gesture feeling enormous and terrifying and necessary. Elena looked down at their joined hands, her fingers wrapped in his, and when she looked back up, her eyes held moisture that didn't quite become tears. Neither of them spoke. Dylan returned from the bathroom and the moment ended, but something had shifted. Some acknowledgement that this was more than friendship, that adults were navigating territories that required care because they involved a child who couldn't protect himself if they got it wrong. March brought the kind of cold snap that felt punitive, temperatures plunging below what was normal even for a city accustomed to harsh winters. Marcus woke at 2 in the morning to Dylan coughing. That particular sound that meant his asthma was acting up, triggered by cold air that made breathing feel like inhaling knives. He stumbled out of bed and went to his son's room, finding Dylan sitting up with his hand pressed against his chest, face showing the panic that came when breath became struggle rather than automatic. Marcus grabbed the inhaler from the nightstand and helped Dylan use it, counting the puffs and watching for the moment when breathing eased back toward normal. But when he put his hand against the wall, he felt no warmth from the radiator that should have been keeping the apartment heated. The landlord, a man named Gunderson who owned 6 buildings and treated tenants like inconveniences that occasionally paid rent, had been promising to fix the heating system for 3 weeks. Now it had failed completely, and the temperature inside the apartment was dropping toward dangerous. Marcus tried Gunderson's number and got voicemail, the recorded message suggesting he call back during business hours as if emergencies respected schedules. He tried the emergency maintenance line and got no answer. Dylan coughed again, the sound wet and painful, and Marcus felt panic flood his system. He couldn't afford a hotel, couldn't miss work to sit in an emergency room, couldn't let his son spend the night in an apartment that was getting colder by the minute. His fingers moved before his brain could construct all the reasons this was a bad idea, pulling up Elena's contact and typing a message that felt like admitting defeat. Sorry to bother you. Do you know any lawyers? Landlord won't fix heat, and Dylan's asthma is getting bad from the cold. The response came within 30 seconds, suggesting she'd been awake despite the hour. Is Dylan okay? Marcus typed back, he's struggling. Cold air triggers the asthma. I don't know what to do. His phone rang immediately, Elena's voice coming through with an urgency that matched his own panic. I'm sending a car. You're staying at my place tonight. I can't. Marcus, your son is sick. Please. The please broke through his resistance. He heard genuine fear in her voice, not for her reputation or convenience, but for Dylan's health, and understood that arguing would waste time they didn't have. He agreed, hung up, and began throwing essentials into the backpack they used for overnight stays that never happened because they had nowhere to go. Within 20 minutes, a car arrived, the driver helping them with their meager belongings and maintaining professional silence during the drive to an address in a neighborhood where Marcus had never been, because people like him didn't have business in buildings where penthouses cost millions. Elena met them in the lobby, her hair loose and wearing sweatpants that looked expensive even in their casualness, and took one look at Dylan before steering them toward the elevator. She'd ordered a humidifier that arrived 10 minutes after they did, had set up a nebulizer she'd apparently had delivered sometime in the previous hour, and transformed her guest room into something approximating a medical facility. She stayed with Dylan while Marcus showered, reading to him until his breathing eased and sleep became possible. And when Marcus returned, he found her sitting beside the bed with her hand on Dylan's shoulder, like she was afraid he'd stop breathing if she let go. They stood in the hallway outside the guest room, speaking in whispers so they wouldn't wake the boy who'd finally found rest. Elena's face showed exhaustion that came from more than lost sleep, the weight of caring about someone whose vulnerability you couldn't eliminate through money or power or any of the tools she'd mastered. Her voice came soft. I called your landlord from the car, explained the consequences of not complying with housing codes. He'll have heat fixed by morning. Marcus felt something in his chest expand and contract simultaneously. Gratitude mixed with the complicated shame of needing help he couldn't repay. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. You'd do the same for me. The certainty in her voice suggested she believed it, that she'd moved past seeing him as charity case or service project into understanding they were building something reciprocal, that care moved both directions regardless of bank balances. Marcus realized with sudden clarity that she was right. He would do the same for her. He would do anything for her, not because of what she could provide, but because somewhere in the weeks since Christmas Eve, she'd become essential to his life in ways he hadn't planned and couldn't undo. They stood in her enormous kitchen, the space bigger than his entire apartment, and she made hot chocolate that probably cost more per cup than his grocery budget for a week. 3 mugs arranged on her marble counter, the third waiting for when Dylan woke. The domesticity of it felt surreal, CEO and maintenance workers sharing hot chocolate at 3 in the morning while his son slept in her guest room. but it also felt right in ways that transcended logic. Elena broke the silence first. This penthouse has been empty for 5 years. I bought it furnished, never changed anything, used it as a place to sleep between work and more work. She paused, looking around the space like she was seeing it for the first time. Tonight, with you both here, it feels like a home. The admission cost her. Marcus could see that in the way she held her mug like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. He set down his own mug and closed the distance between them, taking the space that had felt too large and making it appropriate. His hand found her waist, and she leaned into him, the gesture tentative but willing. And they stood like that for a moment that felt suspended from normal time. When he kissed her, it was gentle and questioning, asking permission that she granted by kissing him back with intensity that suggested she'd been wanting this for a while. The kiss lasted 10 seconds before they both pulled back, aware that Dylan could wake, that this was complicated, that they were building something fragile that required care. But Marcus saw in Elena's face the same desire he felt, the same recognition that this had moved beyond friendship into territory that came with different risks and different rewards. Her whisper came against his lips. I love your son, and I think I'm falling in love with you. Marcus felt his throat close with emotion that made words difficult. He managed to get out the truth that had been building for weeks. I love you too. Both parts. The CEO and the woman who cries over paper Santa hats. They stood in her kitchen while Dylan slept safe in the next room, and the city continued outside windows that overlooked everything Marcus had never thought he'd be close enough to touch. The distance between their worlds hadn't disappeared, but it had become navigable, mapped by connection that didn't erase differences, but made them matter less than what they shared. The months that followed passed an accumulation of small moments that built towards something larger. April brought their first official date, where Marcus hired a sitter he couldn't quite afford and took Elena to a restaurant that wasn't where he worked, where they talked until 2 in the morning about everything and nothing, discovering the particular pleasure of conversation that didn't have to end because someone needed to sleep or work or fulfill obligations to anyone else. May brought Elena's disaster attempt at cooking dinner, Marcus teaching her how to make simple pasta, while Dylan laughed at her mistakes and she laughed with him. The three of them comfortable in Marcus's small kitchen in ways that transcended the space's limitations. July brought their first real fight, Elena wanting to pay for Dylan's education at a private school, Marcus's pride wounded by the implication that he couldn't provide adequately, words exchanged that came from places of hurt rather than malice. She'd left his apartment angry, and he'd spent 3 days convinced he'd destroyed the best thing in his life through stubborn refusal to accept help. But then he'd gone to her penthouse and apologized, and she'd apologized back. And they'd worked through the complicated navigation of a relationship where economic disparities created power imbalances neither wanted but both had to acknowledge. She'd told him she loved him, the words coming in the middle of their apology, slipping out like they couldn't be contained any longer. He'd pulled her close and told her the same, and they'd made promises about communication and honesty and working through hard things because what they were building mattered more than pride or comfort or the easy path of giving up when things got difficult. By the time Christmas returned, they'd built something real. Not perfect, not without complications, but real in ways that mattered. December 24th found them at table 17 in the restaurant where everything had started, the three of them together in the spot that had once been set for one. Marcus had reserved it weeks in advance using the employee discount policy Elena had implemented, the changes she'd made affecting everyone who worked in buildings she owned, their lives concretely better because she'd chosen to act differently. Dylan wore the same paper Santa hat, now nearly destroyed but preserved with tape and determination because it had become symbol of something important. Elena brought gifts that were thoughtful rather than expensive. A framed version of the original hat under glass so Dylan could keep the real one safe. Small acknowledgments that she understood value wasn't measured in dollars. They ordered too much food and shared everything, the way families did, and laughed when Dylan knocked over his water glass and Marcus caught it mid-fall with reflexes that came from years of restaurant work. Elena set down her fork near the end of the meal, nervous energy visible in the way her hands moved. She pulled a small box from her purse and opened it to reveal 2 necklaces, each with a pendant that held a photo of the three of them from the school concert months earlier. The other side of each pendant was engraved with words that made Marcus's throat tight. Family is who you choose. Her voice shook slightly as she spoke. This year, you both gave me something I didn't know I was missing. A place to belong, a family. I'm not trying to replace anyone or claim something I haven't earned, but I wanted to be part of this, officially, if you'll have me. Dylan's response came without hesitation, like a godmother. Or just family, whatever feels right. Marcus felt tears press against his eyes, the kind that came from overwhelming emotion rather than pain. Elena, you already are family. You have been for months. But Marcus had his own surprise, his own moment he'd been planning for weeks and second-guessing every day since. He pulled a small box from his pocket, simpler than anything Elena could have purchased but chosen with care from a jeweler who'd let him make payments over 3 months. Inside was a silver band with a small stone, nothing elaborate or showy, but real and intentional, and meant to communicate everything he couldn't find adequate words for. His voice came rough with emotion as he opened the box. Elena, I know we've only been together a year, and I can't give you penthouses or fancy vacations or any of the things you're used to. He paused, gathering courage. But I can give you this. Every morning, I'll make your coffee. Every night, I'll listen to your day. When you're lonely, I'll be there. When you're scared, I'll hold you. Will you marry me? Elena stared at the ring like it was the most valuable thing she'd ever seen, which perhaps it was because value wasn't about money, but about what things meant. Tears streamed down her face, unchecked and unashamed, and she nodded so vigorously words would have been redundant. Marcus slid the ring onto her finger, his hand shaking, and Dylan clapped with enthusiasm that made other diners look over and smile. The restaurant broke into applause, strangers celebrating their moment with genuine joy. Gloria came from the kitchen with tears on her face. Miguel whistled from the service station, and for 3 minutes, Table 17 became the center of something beautiful and unplanned, proof that sometimes the universe arranged itself toward happiness, despite all evidence suggesting otherwise. They were married in October, small ceremony in the restaurant after closing, Gloria as Elena's maid of honor, and Miguel as Marcus's best man. Dylan carried the rings with solemnity that made the adults fight back tears, wearing a new paper Santa hat he'd made specifically for the occasion. Elena wore a simple dress that Marcus thought made her look more beautiful than any designer gown could have. And when they exchanged vows at Table 17, promising to choose each other every day regardless of what came, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Now, one more Christmas later, they returned to their table with rings on their fingers, and a life built from choosing each other when logic suggested they shouldn't work, but love insisted they would. Elena had stepped back from the CEO role, hiring a COO to handle daily operations, while she maintained board position in strategic oversight, but carved out time for things that mattered. Morning coffee with Marcus, Dylan's school events, lazy Sundays where they did nothing productive and everything important. Gloria brought them dessert with a note that said, "On the house," and a wink that said she'd known all along this would work out somehow. They ate it slowly, savoring both the sweetness and the moment. Three people who'd found each other in a service alcove on Christmas Eve and built something that started with a cupcake and became a family. Elena looked at both of them. These two people who'd saved her from a life that looked successful but felt empty. I still keep that paper Santa hat in my office. I look at it every day and remember. Dylan grinned. You can make a new one next year. My class does it every December. Teachers let parents come. I would love that. Marcus pulled them both into an embrace. This family that made no sense on paper but perfect sense in practice. Outside, snow fell on the city, where millions of people moved through their individual lives, most of them alone in crowds, most of them searching for connection they hadn't found. But inside the restaurant, at Table 17, that was now always set for 3, they'd found what everyone was looking for. Not perfection, not lives without struggle or pain or the complicated navigation of differences that would never fully disappear, but belonging, the real kind, the kind that said you can sit with us, not because of what you have or what you can provide, but because you're here and that's enough. Elena spoke the truth that had taken her 34 years to learn. I spent my whole life building an empire, but I forgot to build a life. Marcus understood what she meant, understood that empires were constructed from isolation and competition, and the careful maintenance of distance from anyone who might make you vulnerable. Life required the opposite. It required letting people in even when it was scary, even when you couldn't control outcomes, even when love meant accepting that you could be hurt because the alternative was safety that looked like death. His response came quiet but certain. You're building one now. They left the restaurant together, walking into cold December air that made their breath visible. Three people holding hands as they moved toward the car that would take them home to the life they'd constructed from unlikely materials. Behind them, the restaurant glowed with warmth and light and the sound of families celebrating together. Table 17 would be reset tomorrow for new diners who'd never know its history, the moments that had unfolded there, the lives that had changed because someone had been brave enough to ask if they could join, and someone else had been brave enough to say yes. Christmas happened wherever someone waited for you, wherever someone saved you a chair, wherever someone looked at you and said, without conditions or requirements, you belong here. Elena had learned that lesson in a service alcove from a 7-year-old boy with a paper Santa hat and his father who'd been terrified and brave enough to let her in anyway. Now she carried that knowledge forward into a future that looked nothing like what she'd planned, but everything like what she'd needed. Not empire, not conquest, just love, complicated and messy, and absolutely worth every risk required to reach it.